In the last video, I demonstrated that an ordinary 203mm aperture or 8-inch SCT, like the Celestron C8, which is in fact what I am using, can capture objects down to magnitude 23 beneath dark skies of Bortle 2 or lower with short subframe exposure times. That video is linked in the description below, and you should see a link to it appear up on the top right now. My focus in my university days, though, was emergent intelligence, or how intelligence emerges out of complex interactions. For example, in a forest, any tree by itself, we as humans would not consider to be very intelligent, but put millions of trees together to become a forest, and they become a superorganism capable of understanding and regulating their own environment. To take that example even further to illustrate, a coniferous forest can generate rain when under drought, and it knows when and how to do so. For that matter, any one of our neurons, our brain cells, individually, is not very smart, but you put a few 100 billion together in a human brain, and suddenly you get what may be the greatest supercomputer in the cosmos, though, to be frank, we still don't really know how it works, not even close. So it's in my nature to try to decipher how and why persons understand or fail to understand things, or what is to me even more interesting, why some persons refuse to see a thing even when the evidence is right there in front of them. So I found myself in the last week trying really hard to understand why some persons, some of whom I know to be quite intelligent and have otherwise contributed significantly to astrophotography, adamantly refuse to believe that short subframe exposure times could capture extremely faint objects in the right conditions and given enough integration time when the evidence was right there in front of them. I mean, honestly, in my early videos on the advantages of short subframe exposure time, some of those persons were looking at pictures of IFN and telling me, well, your images just aren't that detailed. You get more detail if you use long subframe exposure times. For example, this image. This is the galaxy NGC 7497 and the IFN around it. And I think I first covered the power of modern telescopes and cameras to capture extremely faint objects in a video called 0 to IFN in 60 seconds. And you'll find that link appearing in the top right of the screen now, and it's also down in the video description. Now, when I was in university many years ago, the concept of emergent intelligence was much more speculative, and I reasoned that to understand it, I would have to develop expertise in a wide variety of fields, which, as you can imagine, is extremely challenging. We live in an era where there is so much knowledge that a person quite simply cannot develop a sufficient understanding of everything. And I was wrestling with this, and one day I was consulting with a professor who was also a friend of mine, who also was the curator of a geology museum. And I was at the museum just talking to her and about this challenge. How do I pick which fields to study in order to put together the picture of how emergent intelligence comes together? She told me one simple sentence that I've never forgotten. She said, just follow the evidence. And that one simple but poignant line stuck with me throughout the rest of my academic career. And it came to be my modus operandi: evidence above theory, evidence above predisposition, evidence above preconception, evidence above all. So when I started imaging these extremely faint objects using short subframe exposure times, it honestly never occurred to me to question if that could be done because I was doing it. I had never thought some persons would vehemently object to the reality that it could be done to the point I'd ever have to make a video to demonstrate it. And that too fascinated me, hence here we are at this video. And after spending a good part of last week trying to understand what could drive the thoughts of persons who are so vehemently opposed to the simple technique, I posted a question regarding it in the community section of the Sky Story YouTube channel. And a person responded with a straightforward statement that really got me thinking. I'll read it. I am so confused as to why people are so staunchly opposed to your method. It cannot be just confirmation bias. I should clarify, it wasn't a lot of persons that were opposed. It was a few very vocal persons and a few who have astrophotography channels of their own. Some of whom, to my knowledge, are very good astrophotographers, very technically savvy. And their struggle with this concept, it's what really surprised me. And like the person who replied to the community posts, I also don't think it can just be confirmation bias. So I got to thinking, there must be some deeply rooted origin to misunderstanding here. So I started to look into it to try to figure out how that may have happened. So then I did something I ordinarily hate to do, I turned to AI, thinking, okay, AI is drawing its information from a database derived of tens of thousands of contributions. Maybe it'll reveal something I'm overlooking. So I asked Gemini what it thought of trying to image a magnitude 23 object with an 8-inch SCT. Let's take a look at the first few lines of its response. Imaging a magnitude 23 object with an 8-inch or 200mm telescope is extremely challenging and sits at the very edge, or beyond, of practical capability for most amateur setups, likely requiring many hours, typically 5 to 10 plus hours, of total integrated exposure time under exceptionally dark skies. That was my first meaningful clue. Imaging extremely faint objects is beyond the capability of most astrophotographers because it requires extremely dark skies, and that's not something most astrophotographers have these days. So then I thought, let's explore how quality of sky influences persons in choosing subframe exposure time strategies. And that led me promptly in the direction of looking at subframe exposure time calculators, and I quickly found this one at astroimagery.com called Astrophotography Calculator for Perfect Long Exposures. It consists of 3 variables: light pollution border level, read noise of your camera, and acceptable noise level. Unfortunately, because the number values can only be entered from a drop-down list, you have to round down or round up. You have to make that subjective decision. But otherwise, it's a quick and easy calculator to use. Except for one thing, the light pollution border level variable is not simply derived by knowing the border where you are. It's derived by cross-referencing the focal ratio of your telescope with the known border level, which gives you a light pollution level, and then you can enter in the rounded value onto the drop-down menu. And to derive that value, you can use Dr. Glover's chart, which he's listed in a couple of his seminars. It's here. So I live in an area that is about border 1.5. And since I typically have the corrector reducer on my SCT, it has an operating focal ratio of 6.3. Cross-referencing those numbers on Dr. Glover's chart yields a border ratio of about 0.4. 1 is as low as you can go on the calculator, so for me that's a value of 1. The read noise of my Player One Aries M Astro camera is negative 1.5 E. So in the calculator, I'll round that down to 1. And because I care much less about noise in the individual sub than I do in the total stack, I'm going to accept 5% noise. Now this is not the absolute most accurate subframe exposure time calculator out there. It's trying to make this process specifically quick and easy and give you useful ballpark numbers. But according to this subframe exposure calculator, with my monochrome camera shooting in LRGB, 10-second exposures are acceptable. In other words, that will give me sufficient signal-to-noise ratio to begin generating a good image. And even were I to use a one-shot color camera under these conditions, 30-second subframe exposure times would be acceptable. But notice the number that it gives for narrowband astrophotography, 250 seconds. Now, that's still in the range of what I define as short subframe exposure times, anything under 300 seconds. But the key thing to notice here is that shooting in narrowband requires 25 times more subframe exposure time than shooting with a monochrome camera through LRGB filters, and a little bit more than 8 times the exposure time of shooting through a one-shot color camera. Now, as I understand it, the average astrophotographer these days is operating in areas of border 5 to 7. So to get good images, by one means or another, they must use narrowband, whether that's discrete narrowband filters for monochrome cameras or dual, tri, or quadband narrowband filters for one-shot color. They ultimately must use some form of narrowband technology. So they have become accustomed to shooting with subframe exposure times that are vastly longer than a person operating from a dark sky site would need imaging with LRGB. And saying that narrowband needs 25 times more subframe exposure time to develop good SNR than shooting in LRGB is being generous. Dr. Glover, the creator of SharpCap, estimates that narrowband imagers require 25 to 100 times more subframe exposure time to develop a good SNR as compared to persons shooting luminance on a monochrome sensor. So the numbers given in this calculator of 25 times the subframe exposure time is being very generous. So this leads me to think that many of the persons that absolutely vehemently believe that one cannot use short subframe exposure times to capture these extremely faint objects are operating from typical conditions, border 4, border 5, 6, 7, whatever, and they have to shoot narrowband. They just are not used to the short subframe exposure times that telescopes and cameras can go to when shooting under dark skies with monochrome cameras working in LRGB. And to be frank, if I had been shooting for many years under those conditions, I would likely find it difficult to believe as well. So I can understand where they're coming from in that. But I don't think that's the whole picture. The problem gets even more complicated and worse when we consider the rapid and massive changes that have happened with shooting technology in less than the last 10 years. Let me show you. 7 or 8 years ago, Dr. Robin Glover, who I'll note again created SharpCap, did a lecture that's now quite famous among astronomers and astrophotographers around YouTube. In this lecture, he discussed, right around 36 minutes in, how stacking counters noise. And right around 46 to 47 minutes in, he explained how the CMOS cameras of that time could reach effective subframe exposure times down to around 30 seconds. However, in his examples, he was considering cameras that, by modern standards, just aren't nearly as good. Astrophotographers often make the mistake of looking at things like sensor size and megapixels and misinterpreting those as very important features of the camera. Whereas, for shooting really faint objects, what really matters are things such as quantum efficiency and read noise, and to a lesser, but still very important degree, well depth. And in terms of camera technology at the time that lecture was done, regarding read noise, cameras these days are 3 to 4 times better. Quantum efficiency is almost twice as good, and well depth is often 4 times better. By the way, I'm aware many persons watching this channel are relatively new to astrophotography, and if you don't understand these terms and you would like me to go in more depth on things such as quantum efficiency, read noise, and well depth, and why they are so important in imaging faint objects, let me know and I'll plan a future video to cover it. For now though, let me take a moment to explain quantum efficiency in brief, as it's probably the key camera factor in capturing faintness. Quantum efficiency refers to how likely a camera sensor is to convert a photon into information. A quantum efficiency of 50% means that half the photons that impact a camera sensor are not registered. 7 or 8 years ago, amateur astro camera sensors had quantum efficiencies of about 50%. But in just the last few years, there have been massive improvements in camera technology. In point of fact, it's nearly doubled. The Player One Aries M that I have, which has a Sony IMX533 sensor, has a quantum efficiency of 91%. This means that a modern CMOS camera with a modern sensor is registering almost twice as many photons, or, in other words, is deriving almost twice as much information in a given amount of time as a typical camera from a decade ago. High quantum efficiency is directly related to camera sensitivity to light, signal-to-noise ratio development, and faint object detection. If persons are still using older models of cameras prior to, say, from the 300 generation or earlier of Sony sensors, then the cameras will be less sensitive to faint signal and miss a great deal of information. But astro cameras aren't cheap, and I could imagine that upgrades to technology over time have been frustrating. If you're money conscious, like any intelligent person, and you bought an expensive astro camera 5 or 6 years ago, I could well imagine and even sympathize with the reality that you may not want to upgrade it anytime soon. But the improvements in specs like quantum efficiency, which I don't honestly think most people realize the importance of, has made a massive difference in the ability of modern cameras with CMOS sensors to collect information and develop signal. So I think some of the persons who continue to insist that it is simply not possible to collect signal and reveal extremely faint objects, say magnitude 22 or greater, with short subframe exposure times, are basing their thinking around older standards of technology, and those old standards just don't apply anymore. And the world of astrophotography right now is kind of like the way computing technology was around the 80s, the 90s, maybe the early part of the 2000s, where every 3 to 5 years we would see a new generation of technology. Every few years in the world of astrophotography, significant advancements are being made, very significant advancements. And what that means is many things, such as exposure time standards, become outdated very quickly. And I think there is yet another factor that contributes to misunderstandings regarding the subframe exposure time required to capture very faint objects. That misunderstanding is rooted in recommended exposure time for dark skies versus light-polluted skies. You see, when persons live under light-polluted skies, it is recommended that they limit their exposure times. They expose long enough to develop signal from the deep sky object, but they also have to stop exposing before that information is drowned out in light pollution. But when shooting under dark skies, light pollution is not an issue at all. Therefore, images don't have to be limited due to light pollution. Because of this, many persons recommend shooting longer subframes under dark skies to maximize the signal-to-noise ratio in each separate subframe. However, this means they're shooting for the subframe and not the stack. Astrophotography is made by putting stacks of subframes together. What we need to get is a good stack. The individual subframe is important, but it matters much less. The noise in individual subs will be averaged out in the stacking process, and information will be assembled in the stacking process, making a stronger and stronger signal-to-noise ratio. So, it's not as if you have to shoot longer subframes under dark skies. You just have the option to do so without being overwhelmed by light pollution. But if you choose to shoot longer subframes under dark skies, you'll have to contend with all the other risks that are inherent to long subframe exposure times, such as subs being photobombed by satellites and aircraft. In my case, living deep in the backwoods as I do, that occasionally means something like an owl perching on or in front of the telescope, or a moth flying around inside the dew shield. And the longer the subframe exposure time, the more vulnerable each sub becomes to imperfections in your mount, as well as external sources of vibration, such as that caused by wind, or if you're in an urban area, a passing vehicle. The shorter the subframe, the less any of these risks matter. If I lose a couple subs because an owl was perched on the telescope, no big deal, it's 2 minutes. If a bright aircraft photobombs a sub, no big deal, it was 60 seconds. In a whole night, if I lose about a dozen subs to such problems, well, that's 12 minutes. And 12 minutes out of 10 hours of imaging is just not that much of a loss. Whereas, if I were following the maximum recommended subframe exposure times for dark skies, each lost sub would be a loss of 15 to 20 minutes. And that would make the loss of each sub hurt quite a lot. But what must be borne in mind is even when shooting under dark skies, the signal-to-noise ratio is always significantly better than shooting under light pollution. So the reality is, when shooting under dark skies, one needs even less exposure time per subframe than one would need in a town. It's interesting because in a town you need a certain minimal exposure time that's greater than dark skies, but you also have a certain maximum exposure time limit. Under dark skies, you need very little exposure time at all. And while there is an effective limit to how much exposure time you should get, that's mainly limited by the brightness of the deep sky object you're shooting, so that you don't blow out parts of the image. But ultimately, the recommendations have led to a misunderstanding that you need to shoot longer subframe exposure times under dark skies, which, I'm going to tell you, as a guy who shot his entire life under dark skies, is an error. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. And you do not have to shoot long subframe exposure times to benefit from dark skies. Anybody in doubt can feel free to pop over to the Sky Story Astro Bin and take a look at the images I've shot there, all of which have been shot using short subframe exposure times, far below the times recommended by subframe exposure time calculators. But this idea that when under dark skies one needs to shoot longer subframe exposure times due to the recommendations of the subframe exposure time calculators, I think has led to a misapprehension that that must be done. Whereas those subframe exposure time calculators are just giving you an estimate for exposure times for maximum SNR, since you don't have to worry about light pollution. And they make the mistake of recommending for quality for each individual subframe without factoring in the risks inherent in shooting longer subframe exposure times. So to sum up, I think the factors that have led some persons to be so adamantly against this idea of short subframe exposure times is A, they're still thinking in terms of the astrophotography camera technology from 5 to 10 years ago and more, which, in the grand scheme of things, isn't that long ago. B, they're thinking from the perspective of persons who operate under a degree of light pollution and perforce have been using narrowband imaging techniques which require 25 to 100 times more exposure time to develop a good SNR. And C, they've been basing their exposure time expectations for dark skies on the recommendations of subframe exposure time calculators that are effectively recommending best exposure times for maximum SNR per subframe. And this is not at all the same thing as what is the best compromise between the desire to produce the best possible SNR per subframe and the reality of the challenges of shooting long subframe exposures. The goal is to get the best possible stack because it's the stack that becomes an image in the end. And frequently, no, in fact, pretty much without fail, the best way to get the best stack is to compromise on the signal-to-noise ratio in the individual subframes by shooting short subframe exposure times. So, I think that's how these misunderstandings have evolved. If you have any thoughts, observations, or questions to add to this, please feel free to put them in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, I hope this helped, And above all, have fun doing astrophotography and get out there and shoot the sky.